welcome everybody. We see that you've all been probably listening to our conversation, Michael and mine, as we prepare for the session. But yes, officially welcome. My name is Chris Ajemian, CEO and founder of Kate's Tutoring Educational Services, and your co-host for today. Hope you're doing well. Once again, joined by Michael Muska, my dear friend and mentor, who's worked in admissions at Brown, Cornell, Oberlin, Andover, you name it, and now runs Relativity College Counseling. Michael, thanks again for joining us. You're well.
Always good to join you, Chris. Yes, I'm down by the beach in New Jersey, so definitely will. Yes.
Very good. And just having eaten at your favorite place in Asbury for pizza. So
just had a good lunch, and I'm going to the beach after we finish up here. So yes.
Beautiful. We're happy that you were able to slot us in, Michael.
That was the idea. It gave you a slot of time. So yes.
Well, again, housekeeping. I'll facilitate the conversation like usual. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A panel, not the chat thread, the Q&A panel, please, which you can access by scrolling over the bottom of your screen. Also, for the best experience, you may want to set your screen to gallery view, which you can do by scrolling over the top right corner of your browser and selecting gallery. You may also want to click view options at the top of your screen and select side-by-side mode. So Michael and I appear side-by-side, as well as next to the slides in the same window. And that should be pretty good. So our topic for today is the college narrative and building the college narrative. And our discussion is going to be working around elements of the college application narrative, how to find your story, how to support your story, looking at the high school timeline, and then of course we'll do a Q&A. And one of the things that I have found is that this particular topic, the application narrative, many people don't realize just how important it is. I mean, to me, it's the most important topic when you're thinking about college access. And we have a lot of information to share with you today, but again, if there's any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And then, if you do have a question that may be private or delicate or whatnot, you can always just contact either Michael or myself at our phone numbers and our emails. So with that, we'll get the show on the road. Michael, as always, we're starting with a quick update. What is happening in admissions? What's different and new since we met 2 weeks ago?
Well, I think what's crazy is nobody knows what's happening. I think nobody. I was on a session this morning with the director of admissions at Baylor University in Texas, and she said they basically have torn up their playbook that they've used for the last 20 years because everything has changed. Everything is different, in terms of dealing with testing and lack of testing thereof, or in spring grades and lack of spring grades thereof. I mean, it's going to make for a crazy situation. And again, what will happen this fall? Will a lot of schools continue to be pass-fail if they continue to teach online? So I think that's one piece of it. But we've also watched some interesting things. I had a student just get off the wait list at Northwestern last week. You had a student just get off the wait list at Dartmouth. I mean, for kids getting off the wait list in the middle of July, that's unheard of. And so it's clear that universities, even at the very top, are still scrambling to fill up their class. And they're still, obviously creating the caveat that if they take you off the wait list, you must come. You're not allowed to defer. Whether teaching is online or whatever, they still have to stay a full-time registered student in terms of that. We just saw Ithaca College announce that because the state of New York and Governor Cuomo has basically said students, people from 22 different states can't come to New York, they've pretty much told students that are coming from those states, particularly Texas and California and Florida, that unfortunately you can't come to New York to come to school in the fall until this changes, and with the numbers that they're spiking down in those places, we're a month away from school starting for some of these people. It's not going to be better. So I think the issue to me is if you're out there and you're going to go into college, you just got to stay on top of this. You've got to see what's happening in your state, at your school, and make plans. And I still think, as I've said to you before, Chris, that in August, a bunch of kids are just going to say, I'm not going to college this fall, and if there's a problem with the school that I'm going to go to, fine, I'll apply to one of the other 3,000 schools in America and go there the following year. So yeah, things are a little bit crazy. That's what I would say.
Michael, as far as tours go, you had sent me that message a few days ago about virtual tours and college visits. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I think that they're going to be few and far between this year in terms of going to schools and visiting on campus. Schools that I've talked to, for example, don't want students to come and visit them from Texas, Florida, or California. Obviously, we're in a better place in New York and New Jersey and Maine right now than a lot of other places, but we still have to wait and see. Just about every college in the country is saying they are not going to travel this fall like they used to, going to schools, visiting with students, going to college fairs. These things aren't going to happen this fall, and everything is going to be virtual. It's going to be online. Talking to a number of college counselors in New York the last few days, they're all setting up appointments for the college counselor to be there online with their students in a room and having a conversation like they were there in the past, but they're not going to be there. I mean, it's, as I said, it's a whole new world this fall in terms of what's going on.
So that last piece, you're saying that the college counselor is organizing online sessions with the admissions reps at all the different schools.
Yes.
Got it. So instead of the rep coming to the school, they'll be hosting a virtual session.
Exactly. Yep.
Got it.
That'll be the norm this fall. Yep. No question.
On the testing end, if you were on our call a few weeks ago, I was saying how MIT was the only school that was really holding on to testing, but they finally have gone test optional only for the year. They've also done away with SAT subject tests forever. So if you're applying to MIT in the fall, or thinking about applying to MIT in the fall, you don't need test scores. And also, if you have SATs or ACT scores and have subject test scores, don't send subject test scores. They will literally not look at them. Also, some schools are being pretty creative with their testing policies. Like, for example, a student of mine was looking at Hamilton the other day, and she was saying how Hamilton is now, well, it's now, I mean, they've always had like a test flexible option, but it's kind of cool how now some schools are taking your SATs, your ACTs, your subject test, your APs, and actually super scoring based on the best verbal score and the best quant score, maybe one other measure. So in my student's case, she might use her ACT English score. She might take the Math Level 1 subject test, and then she may use her AP US History exam, and that'll be the scores that she is, being evaluated on. And
but the school still doesn't require tests either. So it's
right,
one of these things. Yeah, so it's one of these things that if you got them, submit them, and if they're good, they'll make this combination Hamilton. NYU's been doing this for a number of years as well too. But I think the bottom line is a lot of these schools, if you can't take a test, you can't take a test.
Yeah, which only puts more focus on the non-testing criteria, as we've talked about in the past. So, all right, well, those are plenty for now as far as updates go. Let's take a look at the elements of the application narrative. I guess the first question is, what exactly is an application narrative? And the way that I define it is that, well, look, students who have the best outcomes in the admissions process, they don't just have great grades and great test scores, but their applications tell a cohesive story. And that story is telling admissions, who they are and how they contribute to a college community, either explicitly or implicitly. So this idea of the personalized application narrative is increasingly important in college admissions, especially at top 50 schools, and especially now during COVID-19, where testing is not going to be as much of a factor. So it's really come down to your personal story, your personal character, and kind of like what sensibility you're bringing to campus. But while grades and things like test scores certainly kind of play a part, this is where the essays, the recommendations, and the resume filled with like really meaningful experiences, activities really come to the fore. So, in other words, the application narrative is just really what your application says about you and who you are. And if you think about it from the admissions officer's perspective, they're tasked with working out who somebody is as a person without really knowing them, or in most cases, having met them. So to do this, they're reading a great deal of information about you, and they're trying to piece together to get a sense of who you are as like a fully formed human being. And they do that by pulling together all these different pieces of the application and kind of helping to shape an overarching story. So every element contributes to your story, and all the different pieces want to complement and reinforce one another. Michael, you are a former admissions director, so I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on this idea of what an application narrative is to you.
Well, I think you did a really good job in terms of putting it together just now. But I think the bottom line really is you're trying to figure out how to get the admissions people to know who you are in the best way possible with the most complete story that you can give them. And what that means is taking all the different elements of the application and having them have kind of a flow, a continuum in terms of how that kind of tells that story. So if there's something that you're passionate about or it's really important to you, you want to make sure that as much as you express it in your application, your college counselor expresses it in their letter, your teacher recommendations support it, your activities support it. And we're going to talk about that. How does this all come together in terms of creating a cohesive story in terms of what we call the application narrative?
So let's get into the elements now of this. And so, these are all components of the narrative that want to be working together to tell a cohesive story. So obviously first is your academics, in and outside of class. So obviously grades, course load and course selection, as well as reading and intellectual engagement outside of class, whether that means, doing outside reading, with respect to some sort of school activity or just on your own personally. Right? That's part of the academic piece. Obviously there's also the personal statement and the supplemental essays, and there's an asterisk there because you'll see the top right corner. We're doing a session. Our next session in 2 weeks is going to be specifically on the application essays and particular focus on the personal statement and the supplemental essays. But in these, these are they take a central role in helping admissions understand what your story is going to be. Also, obviously the Common App. The Common App has got your short responses, it's got your initial information essay, it's got your COVID-19 question as a part of this year's application. These also play into your narrative as well. And you have to ask yourself, how can those additional pieces help to support the wider story that you're trying to tell? And if you go to the Kate's webinar page, we talk about how to navigate the Common Application. We touch upon these points, and that we did that seminar, I think, on 24th of June. So then we have the teacher recommendations, like Michael was just talking about. Colleges really value teacher recs because they give them a better sense of who the applicant is as a three-dimensional person, how they interact with peers, their attitude, engagement, curiosity, their role in the classroom. And then with the counselor's recommendation, it'll be who that student is in the wider community. And, the question remains, does the story the applicant is telling seem true and authentic to an external observer? These recommendations can really help to answer that question. And, in a moment, we'll ask Michael for some of his advice on how to cultivate positive relationships with teachers, throughout high school, as well as the guidance counselor. And then there's also the interviews, which is also the cherry on top. Michael has said in previous seminars that you will probably see the interview take on a much more important role in the application process this year, because it has to, because the other sort of metrics are not going to be there. And then sort of finally, this idea of activities and social impact. And we're talking about this, activities and social impact, at least to me, that's usually the foundation of your application narrative. And this is a chance to show how your activities are, a way of sort of like, how you embody your story, how you embody your passions and the values that you sort of talk about or proclaim in the rest of your application. How do you choose to spend your time outside of class? How have you demonstrated what you're passionate about? Are you working towards your future goals proactively? Do you care about positively impacting your community? Do your activities align with the other aspects of your application, or are they random? I mean, you want them to form a cohesive and compelling narrative. So, Michael, from your perspective as a former admissions director, I mean, what gaps, what holes have to be filled? What's your perspective on this?
I think what's interesting is, again, you've summarized it really well, but to think about these days and times, and I think that is going to be critical in terms of applications over the next couple of years. The teacher recommendations, for example, I'm encouraging students that I know to make sure they're using a junior teacher to talk about how a student was able to function in the blended learning of the spring. How were they as virtual learners? Because colleges want to know the self-initiative a student may have taken in that particular situation, the leadership they may have shown in terms of those situations, the directions in terms of other research they might have done. So I think teachers that do that and say that well, I think the downside, which is really weird, as you said before, is, you get to know your teachers. A lot of these teachers, really didn't have the same kind of interaction with students in the spring that they did in the fall. So I think that that's a piece of that as well too. The guidance counselor letter, I think, is something that's really going to be important this year, because the guidance counselor really has to talk about how did the student function with everything that was going on. Just like the students answering a COVID question, the guidance counselor is answering a COVID question. How did their school function? What did their school do? Mm-hmm. And then those kind of, back to the whole narrative, come together in terms of the story of the student and the school. And I think it's totally appropriate. I know there's parents listening today, for parents to be in touch with the guidance counselor, to talk to them about things that they're not sure the guidance counselor knows about that went on during the COVID period and the student was at home.
That's great advice.
To share kinds of insight that the guidance counselor needs to know. You're not telling them how to write the letter, you're just giving them tidbits of that could be included in the letter. And I think this year, they're very, very important. We're going to talk about the essay in a couple of weeks and really focus on that. But there's your story. As I've always said, I always read the essay first because I wanted to get to know the student. And once I read the story, once I read the essay, then I looked, again, back to your concept of the narrative. What else in the application now ties into this story in terms of who the student is? So, like I say, and you mentioned interviews. We were talking before you came on air today about Wake Forest. Wake Forest was one of the first schools that went test optional before all this happened. And as a result, they had a lot of short essays so the admission person could get to know them, but they required an interview. They were one of the few schools of their size that required an interview. And I think they've learned from that was very valuable. And again, back to what you just said a minute ago, I think because admissions people aren't going to meet students on the road. They're not going to meet students at college fairs. They're probably not going to meet students if they can come to campus. An interview could become much more important this year for those schools that are able to do it.
Love it. Pro tip, going off your Wake Forest application, if there's anybody who's watching this webinar right now, whether it's live or recorded, if you're applying to Wake Forest, start with that application because they have so many questions. They're going to make you think through so many different aspects of your persona and your personal history. It's actually a really great way to really sort of, think about what's your complete story because they have like 7 prompts or something. So consider that. All right, cool. So Michael, all this stuff is great, but the question is, how do you actually find your story, right? So the way that I always sort of talk about it is this idea of context. So admissions officers evaluate each application holistically in light of the applicant's context. And so the first way is this idea of geographic context. So when we talk about geographic context, we're talking about, how admissions will look at you in relation to the access opportunities that you had available to you in your geographic location. So if you're coming from, say, New York City, admissions expects you to have made the most of it, but same for the kid in Haiti, okay? Or some other, sort of like location, although the expectations may be a little different because, for example, Haitians have less, availability to resources than maybe some New Yorkers. This is also a reason why under-resourced students are really attractive to schools. They've done more with less. Whereas with New Yorkers, for instance, they have probably likely done less with more. So before I talk about some of the other contexts, Mike, would love to kind of hear your perspective on this idea of geographic context.
I think the most important thing is taking advantage of what your school is able to offer you. In other words, if your school doesn't offer APs, a student can't be penalized for not having APs. If the school does, however, offer a significant number of APs and you shy away from them, and you have classmates from your school applying to the same university, there is certainly going to be a comparison of student to student in terms of, as we've said many times before, the rigor of your curriculum and how you've challenged yourself and being as successful as you can in that particular context. The kid who's from North Dakota, you used Haiti as the example, I'll use North Dakota as the example. When I was at Brown, we may have only had half a dozen applicants from North Dakota, but my direct dean of admissions would say to me, you got to take one because we would try to get one student from every one of the 50 states. And that student was probably weaker no offense to North Dakota, than, some of the many students that we turn down from New York City. So from geographical context, it's also how do you make yourself stand out in the geographical pool of where you come from?
Right. And, there's the sort of like, the state context, the regional context, but what you're getting at is this idea of the school context, right?
Yes.
It's funny. I was talking with a family last week that's in New Jersey about course selection, and the student's a rising senior. He's a great student. He's got an amazing transcript. He's got great test scores. He's doing incredible things with his resume, and he was trying to figure out what his last class was going to be for his schedule. And he wanted to take something that was a little less rigorous, both in general, also for him and in relation to the other people in his school. And I said to him, like, you can do that. But in doing so, you're actually weakening your application profile vis-a-vis all the other kids in your school, because you're not, challenging yourself as much as you could. And, this is a kid who can really kind of probably handle anything. So it was just another kind of reminder that, whether you've got access to 25 APs or a one AP, making sure you're taking advantage of all the different opportunities available to you. Because in some ways, what's more impressive, right? The STI kid who takes 10 of 25 available APs, or the kid in North Dakota or Haiti who takes one AP online, self-studies, and gets like, a 4 or 5 on that test. Do you know what I'm saying? So last piece here on context, this idea of a personal and family context. This is really about resource access, social and financial capital, if I may. Who are your parents, right? If you say that you want to go into business, why haven't you ever stepped foot in your mom's VC firm, or in your dad's consulting office? If you're someone who has means, what are you doing with your resources to help balance cultural inequity? And, mind you, in an engaged way, and that's also kind of hands-on, that does not reinforce your sense of privilege or treat, underadvantaged communities as if they're, anything less than equal to you and equal to, what you're able to bring and contribute to the world. I feel like a lot of times, even pre-COVID, pre-Black Lives Matter, people didn't quite get this, but I'm also seeing too that, in the current sort of social climate, these particular aspects of, an applicant's profile are going to be even more heavily scrutinized. So, Michael, anything to add? Any thoughts on that? Or
well, you use the expression school context. We used to call it school group. How did you stand in your school group of applicants from your school that applied? And when I was at Brown, in a typical year, we might have 100, 120 applicants from Phillips Andover. And I had to sort through, as part of my docket, to go through all the applicants and put it in a context of the school. And back to what you said, looking at how the student has challenged themselves, what's the rigor that they put into their curriculum. And I did compare them, whether I like to admit it or not. That's the reality of the college admissions process. How do you stand in your school context, or what we mean in your school group? And the same thing, as you said a moment ago, too, in terms of family and personal context. If you have come from a family of privilege, how have you used that for the good of others? I think that's absolutely critical in terms of how colleges are going to look at applicants right now, particularly in light of the times of what we're going through in this country. And again, we're going to talk more about that coming up in the next couple slides. But again, that is going to be absolutely crucial and critical. The kid who just kind of said, well, school shut down, I'll go to class and that's all they do, versus the student who really takes an initiative, shows leadership, goes out and does some community service things to help others, and continues to do it this summer while things are still continuing to go on, I think is totally appropriate.
So, with that, then, you and I both agree that this is the key question to be asking yourself, right? To kind of sum this whole kind of topic of context up into, a single sort of phrase or question, are you making the most of the resources and the opportunities available to a student in your socioeconomic position? That is the question. And I'll also add in the words of Michael Muska, and are you doing it towards the common good? Right. So, Michael, anything else to say about this before we move on?
I recall when I was in committee at Brown, it was always interesting is that, I was one of, I hate to say this at the time, but I was one of the elders then. God, I'm an elder now, but I was one of the elders in the committee because many admissions officers are often young graduates of the school, that
Mm,
they know the school, but they come in with a different context than people who have been doing admissions for a number of years. And I can remember some of the younger admissions officers sitting around the table and commenting on the fact of, well, this student came from a family of wealth. This student came from a family of privilege. I don't see anything in the record that shows what they really did because of that. The
mm,
student that, for example, we talk about community service programs. There are community service programs where kids sit on sailboats off an island and then get off the sailboat and go do something for half an hour in the afternoon, and they think that they've done something for community service. Colleges see right through that. Okay, do something in your own backyard. Do something where you can really make a difference. And my God, there are so many people in need right now across this country, in all cities, in all parts of the country. You can do something to make a difference. No question about it.
So that leads us into our next sort of sequence here, which is the three big questions. And if you've been on these webinars before, you've heard me ask this, almost every single time. These are the questions you have to be asking as you start to consider this application narrative, right? And these are the questions that we start every single program off at Cates, at least. Whether it's a test preparation program for the SAT, or career advising, or even academic tutoring. Again, who do you want to be? What impact do you want to have on your community, right? And obviously why. And there's an advertising guru named Paul Arden, who wrote an amazing sort of like booklet, and he says it's not about how good you are, it's how good you want to be. And he says that your vision of your ideal self is your most important asset as a human being, and that's something that I certainly subscribe to, and have done my best to sort of apply it in my own life. But also this idea of the community piece, especially in an age of increasing awareness and emphasis on social innovation, the truly successful people in this world are those who live comfortably and who are truly happy. Those people, much more often than not, are focused on community impact. You may hear people talk about a double bottom line, financial bottom line, but also social impact. And one of the things that we've done at our company is geared everything to operate through the lens of social impact, especially because we're an education company. But anyone who's successful and happy, I mean, they are in some way, shape, or form moving the meter on the ground, whether it's in the local community, regional, national, or maybe even global. And then finally, this idea of why. If we don't understand what's really sort of driving your vision and ambition, then we can't design around it with any authenticity, or and in a way that's going to drive you through the hard times, because they're going to come. I mean, I think one of the things that we haven't really sort of touched upon yet, Michael, is that we really start asking these questions, the real questions, the ones that really matter. I mean, it becomes incredibly challenging, right? And there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, there's going to be some real lows. And if you don't know why you're doing it, you're not going to have the fuel to kind of get through and kind of get over the hump. So, Michael, thoughts on this? I mean, what are you advising your students? What do you have to add?
I mean, what's interesting to me is, we did a session a couple of weeks ago talking about creating the college list. And I
Mm-hmm.
used a metaphor in terms of you've got to be able to look yourself in a mirror and be honest with yourself in terms of who you are and where you're going. This is
Right.
exactly the same thing. It's, what do you want to be? How are you impacting your community? And what is your motivation and your reasons behind that? And we're going to talk a little more right now about, what are you passionate about? What are you going to make a difference in terms of how you continue to do things that really make you someone that university wants to have as part of their community?
Yeah, and one more thing before we go into the next slide, like I know that we're dealing, predominantly right now with 17, 18-year-olds, and it's a whole big world out there, and people may not necessarily know exactly where they want to be, nor should they maybe even kind of commit to that. However, having the self-awareness and understanding like the why, that I think is legit. And however that why, may manifest or evolve over time, you can show that reflection, you can show that insight, you can show that self-awareness, through your application essays. So let me get on now to the next over here. So this idea of building the narrative. So how do we actually build the narrative? Well, number one, we start with the current resume, right? That's always the first step. To sort of evaluate, the current resume or the activity list. You don't have like a fully formed resume, but sort of seeing where we're at right now, that's always where you start. Okay, whether you're working independently, with an outside counselor or whatnot, but looking at the resume is a great place to start. And then secondly, when you're looking at that resume, you're trying to identify the underlying themes. Okay, so even if the resume seems a little too thin or disjointed, themes will emerge, especially from an outside eye. And if you use proper trend analysis and guided reflection, you'd be surprised about all the different connections that you're going to see, and how things start to really kind of link up and sort of add together. And then over here next, based on those emerging themes, what should you do next to reinforce the theme, explore it in a new way, or sort of draw a contrast? And we'll talk about how to sort of attend to that in supporting your story in a minute. But Michael, as far as building the narrative and looking at the resume, themes, and then asking like how to build upon that, anything more to add?
We covered in a previous session also the student who's going to fill out the Common App in terms of what is the order that they might put the different activities that they're doing in that. And we talked in that session about, here is an opportunity, and we didn't really draw the parallel until today, of how you talk about those activities in the top order of your narrative and how it then ties into what people are saying about you in their teacher recommendations, what you're saying in your essay. So having a resume is great, but having a resume that really tells part of your narrative is absolutely the critical piece of that resume.
And just a final thought on this is, it's okay to draw a contrast. It's okay to have things that might seem a bit random and whatnot. I always say to students, if you had those like kind of like antithetical sort of experiences or activities, they may show you, even more. They may give you a different perspective on why it is you, in fact, do love the things that you do love. So, it's okay to have things. If you're really passionate about, say, golf, it's okay to have things that are not golf in your resume. So let's talk about how to support the story, Michael. Which types of activities, can help me build my narrative? Well, we'll talk about these in different kind of pieces. So number one is going to be school activities and clubs. Obviously, they want to see commitment, leadership, impact, alignment. Remember that, every other applicant is the treasurer of the XYZ club at their high school. So unless you can do something really special with it, it might be worth looking to really kind of differentiate yourself by looking for opportunities outside of school to help develop your extracurriculars. And then in addition to that, also, volunteering, and community engagement, which we've obviously talked about a bit. But what's interesting about these two is that most students will have these on their resume, right? So most students will have these on their resume. In the next piece, we start getting into athletics, arts, or music. We also start getting into, say, summer programs, and what's a summer program? A summer program that might be given at a university or through a nonprofit or a community-based organization. And summer programs are an opportunity to explore maybe a new academic interest, or experience, or a skill that may not be available to in your context, whether it's in your school or in your region. It can also be used to deepen an interest, or you can also use it as a way to prepare for maybe a tough class that you have coming up in the fall. Like say that you're doing like a physics course in the fall. You may want to take a physics course over the summer to kind of help prepare you for that. That's totally like legit. And then also this idea of professional experience, internships, work experience, and competition programs like the Intel Award or whatnot. And then finally, how do you sort of, consider those particular bullets? Well, I think many people will have these. So you're looking at like what most people have and then what many people have. And then the question is, how do you make yourself stand out? It's really through passion projects. This is really, the opportunity to really differentiate yourself. So Michael, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on what we're seeing up here on the screen and, how you advise your students as far as, these different bullets.
Yeah, I think, obviously 1 and 2 are pretty, self-explanatory. I think the next section is really interesting to spend a little time on. Because a student has been on a team and maybe even been captain of the team, isn't necessarily that significant to a college if the student isn't necessarily really good at the sport. And so I think we're talking about where athletics or art or music can impact an application. It's the ability to show excellence, to show that you're really good at something. It doesn't have to be all three. Any one of those is perfectly sufficient. And so, for example, a great baseball player, his passion project may be baseball. He's on an outside team. He's playing for his school. He plays in the fall. He's going to different showcases to have college coaches look at him. There's not a whole lot of time to do other things. And that's his passion. That's what he cares about in that respect. So there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe he turns around and then teaches little kids how to play baseball. He thinks about ways of how he continues to be passionate about what he cares about. And the same thing could be applied to a student in art or music as well, too. I really harp on colleges looking at how you used your summer. When I travel to Asia, which I've done for a number of years, I really say to them, and I say it to my domestic students as well, too, colleges want to know that you just didn't sit around and have a good time all summer. And this summer in particular, it's really impressive that you've taken the time and the initiative to show that you sought out programs that, because you couldn't go to a summer class, that you've done something online or continued to do an investigation or projects in terms of that particular thing. When we spoke earlier, the student who's interested in architecture, who does a summer online course this summer in architecture to then be able to apply to Cornell or Lehigh or Syracuse for architecture, can then say, I had this experience. I understand what the program is. I know what I'm going to go into. Professional experience, I've said the same thing all the time to students. And you used the example before, if mom and dad have a business and you don't even step foot in the business, how are you showing kinds of interest in terms of something that you want to go into? An internship, a really valuable kind of experience that you've done things, and shows that as well too. Passion project, I'll give you a great story. I was doing some interviews this week with some students from the Packer School in Brooklyn, Packer Collegiate School in Brooklyn. And listening to their stories, I was doing practice interviews to get them ready for their admissions interviews. And listening to some of the projects that some of these students have taken on kind of just amazed me. And part of me was kind of like, we've got to make sure how you get that into your application. This is what we're talking about today. How does it get into your narrative to tell your story? You're doing research with NYU Langone on some kind of really fascinating thing having to do with cancer. My God, that's so cool. Colleges are going to want to hear and know about it. And you show your passion by doing these kinds of projects. But then you got to make sure the college knows about it and understands the intensity of what you've been doing and the commitment that you've made. Making a commitment, being passionate about something. When colleges see that, that's the biggest thing. I wrote a book years ago, and my entire chapter, what is your passion? What are you passionate about? That's what colleges want to see. They don't want to see the student who dabbles in lots of different things. They want to see the student who's really passionate about one or two things that really mean something to them.
So, what's a passion project? It's kind of like a capstone project. It shows admissions, a context, an achievement, an accomplishment, a project that in many ways acts as the culmination of your experiences through high school. And, for some students, it's a cause, whether that's curing cancer or #MeToo or climate change, Black Lives Matter, plastic oceans, what is all that really kind of amounted to? For some students, it's a cause, and for other students, it's an extreme talent, baseball, violin, along those lines. And, while those particular, talents may not necessarily have a clear sort of capstone experience or project for them, you can take those talents and show excellence and impact with them in other ways. Like you were saying before, Michael, the baseball player who actually takes his talent and uses it to teach under-resourced students, or the violin player who maybe takes her talent and goes into the community and tries to lift people up during COVID-19 by performing a concert every single day online, things like that. There are ways to do it. The question is always, how can I take this talent? How can I take this passion and really sort of transform it into a tangible form for impact? So, these are really interesting questions. And then I think, people always want to know, well, how do I actually develop this? How do I start? When do I start? And so we have this high school timeline that we put together for people, and I'll walk us through it.
Before we start that, I think what's important also to say is, we've talked about this too, have students think about how they convey this to the school.
Sure.
If they create a website, if they have YouTube videos, if they have kind of published papers that they've been involved in, all these things create links in your application so the college can see it. I always argue the back page of the Common App, when it says, is there anything else you want to share with us? A lot of counselors say, oh, don't put anything in there unless you really need to explain a bad grade or something. No, this is a place to put the links for college admission people to see all the cool stuff that you've done.
I love this because I have a student who's currently a rising senior, and she has been, we'll simply say she's been on like on the path, on the journey to figuring out how really to take her interest in advocacy and overcoming injustices sort of into like the real world. And she's had a couple of different sort of starts and stops, not of her own fault, just adults and organizations need to be a bit more open-minded about working with a younger person. But this gets to what you're saying. She recently started writing a blog, and it's been incredible how her blog has managed to bring together all these other things that she's been working on in a very sort of like coherent and compelling way. And so it's like what you're saying, even in times like these, the internet's still up. And obviously there's a lot more people online than there has been ever before because of COVID-19. Like, if you're asking questions about how to channel your energy, formulate something, the internet is there for you. So whether it's a website, whether it's a blog, or some other strategy or channel, it is there, and it is possible. So thank you for that, Michael. Timeline. So you may have already read some of these bullets, but I'll go through it. So obviously exploring various extracurriculars. And when you're a freshman, it's game on day one. It is. So you want to start exploring various extracurriculars. Don't need to commit necessarily, but throw yourself out there. Try and test and experiment with different sort of organizations, clubs, activities. This is really your time to experiment. Obviously, take challenging courses in areas of interest, and also try to read outside of class and read widely. Start thinking about summer programs and internships before Christmas and really November. There's a couple of really interesting programs, particularly for some upperclassmen. But there's other programs out there where their application deadlines are in December, or they open up and they do like first come first serve, beginning December 1. So you really kind of be ahead of that, and obviously get involved in your community both in school and outside of school, and begin to. This is really the point of freshman year. Begin to cultivate your interests and define your future plans. Again, we're not committing to becoming a NASA scientist when we're 13 years old, but you want to start really asking these questions a bit more meaningfully and deeply. Then as sophomore year goes, it's just building upon that foundation from freshman year. So, whereas freshman year you were experimenting and trying out extracurriculars, now you really start to kind of like commit to those extracurriculars, right? And looking for leadership roles, or maybe kind of like getting on the path for a leadership role, or maybe even creating your own role within the organization. I've seen students do that. They see that the organization is not functioning, to its best ability. And if there was a person who was in, say, like a communications chair or there was like a computer science branch of a physics club, they may actually take that up as a cause. And then, begin to think about designing and implementing your passion project, whatever that might mean for you. Again, continue to take your most challenging courses, think about the summer programs again, and then starting to enrich your interests and reassess your vision for the future, now that you've had 1 year, year and a half, or 2 years behind you. And then we'll get into this, the next piece here, and before we go to Michael for his input. But juniors, junior comes around, we want to start to define and create what I call like your legacy at your school. Okay. Where is it you made impact, right? Again, continue taking courses, begin really cultivating teacher relationships like Michael had talked about in the past. You've been there now for 2 years, now in your third year at school. You may have your junior year English teacher might have been your freshman year English teacher. Really start to, develop those relationships more intentionally and more authentically. Again, summer programs, start to refine and grow the passion project. You want to have launched by then. All these different pieces start to, really kind of coalesce into defining your narrative. And then, as you're doing all this, particularly in the second semester of junior year, you want to start asking yourself how all these things might kind of play into your personal essay or your college application essays in general. And then senior year, you're really in the barrel of the waves, so to speak. So continue taking the courses, reading, cultivating the relationships. You're probably growing the passion project now, and then obviously you're also finalizing the narrative, because you have to figure out how each piece of your puzzle really kind of fits into the cohesive story, finalizing the college list, and of course, crafting and, detailing and polishing your college essays, as well as the school specific supplement. So Michael, as far as timeline goes, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, anything to add, anything we're missing here?
I talk about the triangle. The triangle is that early in your career in high school, you're trying lots of different things. You figure out what really is going to be important. But as you progress to sophomore year, junior year, and finally senior year, the triangle narrows. You start to put your time and your intensity and your passion into those few things that kind of come to the top of the triangle. So I think that's a good analogy in terms of thinking about how this fits in terms of that particular piece. And under seniors, I really like one of the things you put there in particular. Does the narrative align with each school's values? A lot of colleges have a supplemental essay, why us? And you better be able to explain why you're interested in their school based on the narrative that you're presenting in your application, that they align together. Because if you have a narrative that's totally antithetical to the values and the interests of that particular school, the school's going to see right through it. And I remember a case when I was dealing with a couple kids who applied to schools in Washington, D.C., and I remember the person at George Washington calling me and saying, the student who wrote this could have written this for Georgetown, American, and Catholic. There's nothing about us at George Washington that's in this reason in terms of making them align with who we are. So again, does it align? It's doing your homework on each school. We've said this all along. Show love to every one of the colleges on your list, and the narrative needs to align with the values of those particular schools.
That's brilliant. I mean, I'm thinking about an anecdote that one of my students in New York once had when she was doing her school visits, and she said, and funny enough, ironically, at Brown, the Brown admissions officer, when they're talking about the essays, said to the group, and remember, Brown is not spelled Y-A-L-E. So this idea of being very intentional and very, very thoughtful about, how you and that school really align values-wise, and how it also plays into your application narrative. So it's great. So Q&A, we got a number of questions in the registration, which we'll start to go through, but I'll remind everybody that we have our Q&A panel, and you can put your questions about anything that we've discussed in the Q&A panel. I'll manage that, but we're going to start, Michael, with some of the questions that we got. Number one being, can you start the narrative in 11th grade, or is it too late by then? Thoughts?
Yeah, it's one of the things we were talking about earlier. I said to you, Chris, I said, a lot of our audience are going to be 11th graders going into 12th grade. And when they start seeing what you said about 9th and 10th, they panic. The reality is, you got to play catch up a little bit. But then you go back, and it's something you said earlier too, Chris. you go back and you reflect on what things you did in the ninth grade and what things you did in the 10th grade. And it may very well fit into the pattern that we showed earlier. But now the key is, if you're going to the 11th grade, how you can really up the ante in terms of that, and especially the same thing if you're going to the 12th grade. But no, you're never too far behind. It's just a question of how you catch up.
You know, I'll also reinforce something we had said earlier, which is, again, let's just take a look at the resume. There might be some themes, and there might be a journey, and there might be some progress in a direction that you may not see for yourself, right? Oftentimes I say to families, my role is to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. Yep. And you doing golf over here, and then you doing cooking over there. There might be something that actually connects those two that also resonates with all the other pieces. I mean, the truth of the matter is this: is that most students have a theme. They may have more than one theme, but they usually have about 2 or 3 themes that are pretty strong and consistent. It's really a matter of identifying, what those underlying themes are through thematic analysis, and then figuring out how to present that, in your application narrative and through your essays. And so, even if you feel like you have nothing going on, you have, no theme, everything you're doing is disjointed and fractured, honestly, there's some sense to the chaos. And so, it just might take another person to kind of see that, who's either done it before, just has some perspective on it. But, it's never too late to start, and you may be surprised at what you find, what you unearth. Michael, there's a question here.
I've always, let me say one more thing. I've always said that the best part of being a good counselor is being a good listener. And I've always kind of valued the fact that I try to let the student keep speak, and I say more, tell me more, because then I start to hear the things that start to tie together and start to create this theme in terms of what we're going to make as part of our narrative. And if you don't have a good counselor, find somebody else you trust who can help you with that. Even mom and dad can help you with it. They know you as well as anybody, but be willing to talk through to kind of create the narrative of who you are.
I love that. Just keep asking questions. It's funny, obviously, the deeper you go into a conversation, not only do you find out more, but you also you start to kind of hear the repetition. Oh, what you just said at hour 2 connected to what you said 5 minutes into this conversation. So I love that. We have a question here from Kristen in the live Q&A. If you're a president or leader / founder of probably a number of activities, how do you pick the ones that best define you? How do you choose? Michael, thoughts on that?
Well, if that's my Kristen, I think I know the answer in terms of that and what we're going to talk about. But I think in terms of the important piece about all this is something you said before, Chris. You can have 2 or 3 things you're passionate about that you've shown leadership in, but they should tie in together in some ways in terms of what's really important to you, And I think that there's going to be one that stands out versus the others. Still important to include those others, but think again in terms of the narrative about what is the most important theme and narrative you want to have come through in terms of your story.
Well, it's funny because as I'm looking at Kristen's question, clearly there's a leadership thread going on there. But if Kristen's leader / founder of a number of activities, I also kind of wonder, is this somebody who's an entrepreneur? Clearly, this person has an appetite for creating things that they don't see in the world that they think address certain issues or problems, right? And as you sort of look at, if there's a number of sort of new organizations or activities that Kristen has founded, she might be somebody who in the future wants to go to, or even for undergraduate, go to a school where there's opportunities for entrepreneurship. Or
go to Babson.
Right? Or go to Babson, right? With the Arthur Blank Center for Entrepreneurship there. It's funny, I have a student who's currently at Duke, rising senior, and what's interesting was that she had done literally every single community service opportunity. She had maxed them all out at her school. And what was funny about it was that she was named her senior year, sort of the community service board director. And, she was surprised that she was elected because she felt like she hadn't really quite committed to all, to a particular, activity or whatnot. And I said to her, her name's Elizabeth. I'm like, Elizabeth, The reason why you are the director of the community service board at your school is because you have done all of these and you understand them. So you understand all the things, everything that's common about them, everything that's different about them. So just another example of, looking at a whole kind of a collection of assets, if you will, and then, sort of like threading the needle and seeing what the theme is. Sometimes it's something that kind of rises right to the top, and maybe you are, a creator, president, leader, entrepreneur. It might be something that, surprises you. So Kristen, thanks for your question. Going back, and again, please put any more questions in the Q&A. Michael, I'll go back to our questions that were submitted. I love this question. How essential is a senior schedule in creating an application narrative? I touched upon it earlier with that student of mine at that school, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Michael.
No, you did exactly. I mean, the student that basically kind of really builds up their schedule in terms of who they are is going to be compared to other students from their school when they make that application to university. So it's really important that senior year is not the year to let up, and even more so this year. I mean, I think I've told the story of Princeton, who made the decision to drop EA this year because they want to see the fall semester worth of grades and work. And I have to commend them for doing this, because there are a lot of colleges, they're going to have kids applying early who had a kind of confused spring of junior year and are only going to be submitting a month and a half of work from the fall semester of senior year. I think there are going to be a lot of students who may be deferred early because school's going to want to wait and see what happens in terms of the fall grades. So I think that first semester senior year this year, the quality, the meat of your kind of schedule are going to be very significant this fall.
And I'll just simply add one more thing. I didn't mention it before in that story, but it's apropos in the context of your response and the question being asked, Michael. But that student was choosing between AP Government and AP Stats. And he's somebody who wants to go into the business world. And I said to him, if you're going into business, taking AP Stats makes so much more sense for you. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, especially the future of business and data analytics, I mean, having AP Stats in your transcript has prepared you for your business and education so much better than AP Government would, given his particular interests. Exactly. If he was someone who was going to politics or whatnot, it'd be a different sort of story, but that's another example.
Yep, good example. Yep.
So are sports, music, clubs, or community service most important? Don't see how there's time for all three. I think we've answered this, which is they're all important, but I'd say this idea of, whatever your impact project is going to probably be the thing that kind of ties it all together. I mean, Michael, anything to add to that? Or
better to be great and good at one of them than not try to, be, kind of a dilettante in several of them.
There you go. Here's a great question. Activities applied to rather than sign up for are more valuable. In COVID times, what activities can be applied for? Thoughts?
Oh, I mean, we've been through this so many times in pretty much every session that we've been talking about. Doing things that make a difference for somebody else during the COVID times is what's going to make you stand out. There's no question in terms of service, service to others, service to community, whoever you're doing it for to help the general good is going to be seen in a positive light right now. And I wouldn't worry about activities that you did all the time at school that you're not able to do anymore. Show some initiative, come up with something else that's really cool. You've said before, Chris, students who've created projects through all this that have made a difference in terms of showing something for somebody else. Those are the kids colleges are going to get excited about this fall.
Right. So applied for, signed up for, what's more valuable? I agree, applied for is more valuable, but in COVID times, the ones that you maybe kind of creating your own will be the most valuable. Michael, your feedback actually ties perfectly into the next question, which is, can it be helpful to emphasize activities that you've been doing for many years, i.e. before high school and during? We'd love to hear your comments on that, Michael.
It's back to passion. If you've been doing it for many years, you're demonstrating a passion of something that you're committed to, and you've continued with it and and that shows something in terms of consistency. And colleges are going to look for students who have been consistent, who've been passionate about a particular activity, because they expect you to take the same kind of commitment to whatever you take up in college.
And then over here, how to make my narrative activity sound more interesting or appealing? And is there a suggested structure to phrase them? I found this question interesting. I would say, as far as structuring goes, we're looking at the application narrative. And we talked about this in our Common App webinar back on the 24th of June. And it was 24th of June. Maybe it was like what was it? What's today? 22nd, maybe it was the 8th. But also coming up next week. The personal statement or the personal essay is really the core and the center of the application. And as far as structure goes, I would say that personal statement or personal essay, really wants to help show like who you are at a DNA level and really highlight the theme that makes everything else in your application make sense. So I'd say, it's the story that can't be found elsewhere in the application, but that reinforces the other stories that are found elsewhere in the application. And then Michael, next question here. Do schools distinguish GPA based on high school attended?
Say that again, please. I'm sorry.
Sure. Do schools distinguish GPA based on high school attended?
Interesting question. This is going to be terrible for anybody who goes to these kinds of schools. But I remember when I was at Brown, and if we saw a kid applying from a Catholic high school in New York and they had less than a 95 average, we thought they were a B student. So I think that, yes, schools get reputations in terms of who they are and how they grade. And one of the important things for many universities is that they have people in their office who are specialists in a geographic area, who are basically, it's their job to know the high schools that they're looking at, the applicants that are coming from those high schools. And they have a sense that this is a school that, yes, if there's a bunch of B's on the transcript, that's okay, because this is a school that really challenges its students and grades them very hard versus other students who give away A's like water. So I think it's really important in terms of making sure that colleges take the time to understand the grading context of particular schools. Yes.
Thank you. Just a couple more and we'll wrap up. Can you suggest any short-term volunteer opportunities in August for a 16-year-old that can be done from home? Thoughts?
I don't know if you got an answer, Chris. I
do.
Go ahead. You go ahead. Take it.
I think one of the interesting things about this summer, it's funny, there are people who have COVID-19 and there are people who don't have COVID-19. And there are people who are actually doing interesting things to either help people with COVID-19 or because they had it and want to help people with COVID-19. So for example, I was a student in the UK. She actually had COVID-19. She got over it. Her and her mother had it. She got over it. And one of the things that she's doing with a friend in, of all places, like South Carolina, is they've actually created an organization called Cookies for COVID. So what they are doing over the course of the summer, and they actually started back in the spring, they're going to be continuing it, is that they're basically baking and, being connected with people who can't leave their homes and bringing these baked goods to them, not just to give them great, amazing desserts, but also to make them feel loved, make them feel like they're being thought of during this time. And also so they have some connection with the outside world as they self-quarantine. Additionally, what she's also doing is she's volunteered to be part of a clinical trial at Imperial College, and she's going through different rounds of testing to help them develop a vaccine. So as far as short-term opportunities, what is it that you can do to maybe help people dealing with COVID? And whether it's because they're a COVID patient or maybe even a health worker. So that's one idea. Michael, anything to add to that? Or
I guess I would argue in some respects too, that hopefully in August, things will be a little better, depending on where you are. And maybe you'll be able to get out and do more rather than having to do things from home. But I think something that you talked about before, the student who created the blog that helped them start to understand more about who they are. I think students can be creative from home in terms of those kinds of things. There are a lot of people out there right now who are looking for somebody to talk to. They would want some emotional support. They would want somebody to know that what they're going through, that they're not alone. And I think that there are a lot of resources out there that you can connect to where you can become one of those people that's able to help others who are a little bit frustrated right now with their life situation and are looking for someone to say, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, that's something that actually could potentially be material for the COVID-19 essay on the Common App in August. So, Michael, we've gone through all of our topics and questions. So we'll thank everybody for attending. I love that picture of you, by the way, Michael. It's a great tie. It matches the color of your wall, actually. And as we've been doing the last couple of weeks, exclusive offers here. It's a 2-hour admission strategy session, save up to 50% on the actual usual price if you use the code EDGE50. So that's EDGE50. So EDGE50, and you can apply it to any time with either Michael or myself or somebody else on our respective teams. If you want to design a school list, you want to craft your application narrative by looking at your resume, to help you kind of find your hook. Creating a strategy for a particular school, or feedback on essays, or any other questions you want from admissions experts, you are able to, by virtue of attending this webinar, able to exercise that that offer. And otherwise, if there's any questions that you have about any of the content that we had discussed today, please feel free to contact us. Here again is our information, and we'll be very, very happy to help. Otherwise, Michael, any final parting words or parting shots?
Well, I think it's, we've said creating your narrative is absolutely critical in terms of who you are. And I've said a number of times, the first thing I always read when I opened an application was the essay. I wanted to get a sense of who the student was, to get to know the student before I looked at anything else in their application. So if they wowed me with their narrative in terms of what they talked about in their essay, I looked for other things to support that, to tie into it, to create the theme of what the application was all about.
And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about that exact topic. So I'll just simply say, other than thank you, to quote the wise Michael Muska, stay on top of all the changes. Make sure that you're informed, because things are changing literally by the minute in admissions, and you want to make sure that you're in the know. So thank you for your time. I hope you found today's session useful and productive. Hope we'll see you again in a few weeks. Otherwise, stay cool, stay safe, and be well. Thanks. See ya.
Take care. Thank you.